Thank you. So can everybody hear me? Is my mic on? Yep, I think it is. Yep, okay. I think I'm the only one that doesn't need to turn off his cell phone because I was lucky enough to lose my cell phone on the way here. So that's not a problem for me. So first of all, hi everybody, and welcome to BriForum, and welcome to my session, HTML5, the new application platform. By the way, I actually have two HTML5 related sessions in BriForum, and so from conversations that I've had with some of the attendees, I guess that there might be a little bit of confusion between the two. So to clarify, this session is about HTML5 in general. It has nothing specific to do with desktop, remoting, or anything. It's just about the HTML5 itself as a platform for creating web applications. The other session is HTML5 Remote Access, which is about a specific implementation of HTML5 for creating remote access client for RDP, ICA, VNC, whatever protocol, remote access protocol that you may want to choose. The other thing I want to say about this session is that this is actually the second time that I'm doing this presentation. The previous time was in BriForum London, as you can perhaps tell from my t-shirt, 2 months ago. And that time, I actually ran out of time during the session, which is really not surprising given the breadth of the content associated with HTML5. So this time I did the obvious thing, and I added even more content and more demos into the session, which I guess pretty much guarantees that I'll run out of time again. So what I'm going to do is, as Brian told you, you will actually have access to the video recordings both from this BriForum and BriForum in London. So what I will do is some of the topics that I went to in depth in BriForum in London, I'll actually skim over a bit this time, and I'll just point out to you that if you want more information about those topics, you can see that you can get that information from the London video. So let's start. You know what? Before I start, does anybody here know what this is? Well, it's a laptop, but can anybody guess what kind of a laptop this is? Yeah. Oh, that's correct. I don't know who said that, but this is a Chromebook. Chromebooks run an operating system called Chrome OS. And what's special about the Chrome OS is that it can only run web apps. You cannot install a native application onto a Chromebook. The reason that I'm using a Chromebook is in order to emphasize that all the demos that you will see during the presentation, and hopefully there will be a lot of demos, are all HTML5. There are no native apps involved, no special extensions or plugins involved. It's all pure HTML5. And using the Chromebook basically guarantees that. In fact, the presentation itself, if you can tell, has a browser address bar above it because the presentation itself is done as HTML5, as an HTML5 app. I'm using an open source Google template for creating presentations in HTML5. And as you will see, it actually enabled me to do some cool stuff within the presentation itself. So let's also make this full screen. Okay, so let's begin. First, to introduce myself. My name is Dan Shappir. I'm CTO and VP R&D at Ericom Software. Here's my Twitter account. I also have a blog, which I unfortunately don't update as regularly as I used to. I'm a developer, not only in heart, but in practice. And I've been doing HTML-related app development and rich application development going back to 1997. So, you know, before it was really as popular as it is today. So the agenda for this talk. We will talk about, first of all, we will define what HTML5 actually is. Then we'll talk about how HTML5 came about. I'm a bit of a history buff, and I really like to, and the reason that I like history is because it enables you to understand how things came about, and understanding that really enables you to grasp what they're intended for and what they can do and what they can't do and so forth. We'll talk about HTML5 features and capabilities, and we'll have a lot of cool demos to show these. One of the things that HTML5 is particularly good at is demos, as we will see. And we will talk about HTML5 versus native apps. I mean, that's a constant discussion. Brian keeps blogging about this topic. I'll give my own personal perspective about when I think that HTML5 is preferable versus when I think native apps are preferable. OK, so let's start with a cool demo. One of the things that obviously HTML5 can do, one of the main things that drove the creation of HTML5 is the fact that you can do video in the browser without being dependent on external plugins or add-ons like Flash. And all you need to basically do is just stick a video tag inside the HTML, and that's essentially it. But the fact that the video is integrated into the HTML5 standard, beyond just making it easier to use a video, also means that the video can interact with the other components in the page, which enables you to do stuff like this. Let me find my cursor. Stuff like this. What's happening here is that the video is actually grabbed and rendered into what is known as a canvas element. We'll talk about that later on. And then you can apply various graphic effects onto that canvas. So what we are seeing here is that the integration of video into the HTML5 standard actually enabled to do stuff with video that you might not have been able to do before by interacting with other components of the web page. Let's get out of this demo. And again, the benefit of actually doing the entire presentation as an HTML page is that I can stick all these HTML5 demos directly into the presentation itself. OK, so what is an HTML5 web application? This is my definition, but it's kind of based on stuff that Google are saying, or Apple, or Microsoft. So it's taking the power of the cloud, which is the ability to host data and applications on cloud services, combining that with native app richness, and getting what I define as HTML5 web apps. So it's this combination of having both the data and the application itself on the cloud, delivered to the end user through the web, but having the experience that users normally associate with native applications. You know, not clunky forms that everybody can tell, well, this is very simple HTML. What is native app richness? It's immersive. It has to use stuff like animations, like transitions, video, audio, 3D effects. The user has to have the perception that, you know, the application kind of comes out at them. It's not something like flat. It surrounds the user. It has to be responsive. A lot of HTML5 is about how to make, you know, it used to be the worldwide wait. So HTML5 is also about making it as responsive as a native app. You click a button, the app responds immediately. It's interactive. If you're using an iPad, we will actually, some of the demos that I will do will be from an iPad, because I want to show how it reacts to stuff like multi-touch, orientation, or voice input. We'll see if that works. Native look and feel and behavior. You want to do stuff like drag and drop. You want to be able to, let's say, drag a file from your desktop into the web page, into the web app, and have that web app react to that file when the user drops it in. You want offline support. That's kind of key, but at the same time, that's where HTML5, that's kind of one of the HTML5's weaknesses. Perhaps we'll have time to go into that in a little bit more detail, but it's getting there. And undoubtedly, there will be a point in time where HTML5 apps will be as capable in working offline as native apps are. You want to leverage device capabilities, stuff like geolocation, audio and video capabilities, and chat capabilities. So HTML5 web applications are first and foremost about the client. All the technologies that you see listed above you have nothing to do with the server side. You know, the web, you have the browser, you have the web server. All these technologies that are part of HTML5, well, most of them, almost all of them, are about what the client can do, what the browser can do. The web server can be the same old web server that you used forever. It could be IIS, it could be Apache, PHP, ASP.NET, whatever you want to choose, it doesn't matter. HTML5 is primarily about what's going on the client side in the browser. So let's start with a nice demo app that kind of shows what an HTML5 app is. I don't know if you've heard about it. It's called Yahoo Pipes. It's basically an app for creating feeds, like RSS feeds. But what's cool about it is that you can actually have this graphical environment for editing your pipes. The whole concept here is about the data flowing, and you're adding all sorts of data sources and filters and merging in sources, different RSS sources into one. So in this case, for example, I took brianmadden.com, and I forget what the other one is that I took, and then I merge them, but make it unique. So I remove duplicate items, and I sort them, and so forth. But what's cool about this is that this environment doesn't work like what you would expect a web app to work with, a form that you have drop-down boxes and whatnot. It works like a native app. I can grab these things, move them around. As you can see, the lines move accordingly. I can drop new items onto this drawing board and configure them this way. So at the end of the day, I don't really care about this application that much, but I wanted to highlight the fact of this is how an HTML5 app is supposed to work. It's interactive, it's immediate, it's responsive. This is what it is, okay? By the way, if you do have any questions during the presentation, don't hesitate. I'll hopefully leave some time at the end for questions and answers, but still, if you have any questions, don't hesitate, lift your hand, and unless it's a very long answer, I'll try to answer on the spot. Okay, so the benefit of HTML5 web applications. No installation on the endpoint. It's just delivered like a regular web page. It's an app, but it's a web page. So you just browse to a URL from favorites, from bookmarks, you got via email, whatever, downloads into the browser, no installation whatsoever. It means also that you shouldn't have any prerequisites, not in terms of configuration. There's no patching or updates. You want a new version, you just put a new version on the web server. The next time the user goes to that same URL, the user gets the new version. You don't have to worry about rollbacks. Again, you just put the correct version on the web server. It's write once, run anywhere, at least theoretically. It's as close, I think, as we've ever come. Java was supposed to deliver that. Java kind of failed on the endpoint, although it's kind of making a comeback in the Android, but that's a very specific use case. HTML5 is as close as we've come so far to have apps that can really run on any device. And we'll see an example in a second. So it supports lockdown devices and endpoints as well, which means that it could be a kiosk or a lockdown station, a hotel, airport, or whatever, or your friend's house where you just don't want to modify anything. Because, again, it's just a web page, it's not changing the system that it's running on. It's always up to date because, again, when a new version is placed onto the web server, it's downloaded the next time you visit it. You've got lots of platforms to choose from in terms of the development. On the back end, certainly I mentioned a couple of before. Also on the client side, you have all the various browsers and all the various devices. And you don't have to deal with an app store. An app store is both a boon or a benefit, but also it can detract from the value. Because when you submit something to the Apple App Store, you have very little control over the process that Apple takes in order to whether to accept an app or not accept it. And if they reject it, it's not always clear why they rejected it. And you also have to pay a cut to Apple. So one of the advantages of you doing something as an HTML web app is you can just bring it directly to the user without having to go through an app store. And it's cool, at least in my mind. I guess that we developers have a different perception of what is cool in normal people, but from my perspective, HTML5 apps are cool. So what don't HTML5 apps need? Well, they don't need virtual desktops, and they don't need terminal services, and they don't need connection brokers, and they don't need application virtualization, and they don't need client hypervisors or layering. In other words, you won't have to go to BriForum anymore if you create all your apps as HTML5 web apps. Well, which is also maybe a shame because of all the beer that you'd be missing. HTML5 web applications can provide the richness and power of native desktops applications without a lot of the headaches that are usually associated with native applications. So what is HTML5? HTML5 is the first version of HTML that has its own logo. And it's obvious that the person who created this logo watched too many Superman movies, but they actually encourage people who create HTML5 apps to put this logo on their web pages. So if you see this logo on a web page, it's an indication that this website is using at least one HTML5 feature. Okay, so now we come to the motivation for HTML5 apps. So I don't know how many here are familiar with Douglas Crockford. He's very famous in the web development circles. He is one of the you could say the pioneers or the leaders for JavaScript. He invented JSON. And he defined the whole back in 2006 as the fact that the browser was not designed for general purpose application, as a general purpose application platform. Now, why is that a problem? It's a problem because despite this fact, which was definitely true, people had been using the browser as an application platform since the mid-90s. In fact, I, for example, was doing exactly that. Back in '97, I created an application that ran completely on the client side, yet its interface was completely done inside, well, at that time it was IE4. Now, why is that a problem? It's a problem because you're using the platform for something that it wasn't intended to be. The browser originally was not designed to be an application platform, and that created a lot of problems. You had performance issues. You had memory leaks. You would run that app, and the app worked great when you had 100 items in the list, but would crash terribly when you had 300 items in the list. So the fact that you were trying to use the platform not for what it was intended was creating a lot of trouble. At the same time, people definitely wanted to use this platform in this way because of all the strengths and capabilities that they could already see in this platform. So one solution was a Band-Aid type of a solution, which was using browser plugins to enhance the capabilities of the platform. Really, since the early days of the browser, you had the ability to have these add-ons, which were essentially like DLLs most of the time, which the browser could load to handle certain types of content, and the browser would load that DLL, hand the content over to that DLL, but also hand to that DLL a certain region of the screen that the DLL could render on that region whatever it wanted. The famous ones are the Java applets. Well, they're effectively dead. Nobody is creating, as far as I know, nobody's creating new Java applets anymore. Again, people are using Java, but they're using Java on the back end. They're using Java on Android. They're not using Java applets in the browser. This Chromebook, for example, doesn't support Java applets at all. Flash, we're all familiar with Flash. Flash is dying. Adobe effectively stated that Flash is dying. It started dying when Apple decided not to include Flash support in the iPad. And then now Microsoft decided originally not to have Flash support in Metro mode. Now they're kind of backtracked on that a little bit. They're going to allow it for some whitelisted sites. Flash is going to be gone from Android, I think in version 4.1. And Adobe themselves are moving away from Flash to HTML5. Microsoft Silverlight, in my opinion, was stillborn. It was created to combat Flash, and by the time it came about, to an extent, and by the time it came about, Flash has already started dying, so what's the point? And again, you know, in Metro mode, you effectively don't get Silverlight in the browser. So even Microsoft are kind of moving away from Silverlight to HTML5. And to be honest, I'm not that familiar with any site not by Microsoft or not somehow sponsored by Microsoft that uses Silverlight. I don't know, maybe some of you are, I'm not. IE6 and ActiveX, we all want this to be dead. It's a zombie. It refuses to die to an extent, but I guess there is hope. You know, with HTML5, with modern apps, hopefully people will finally dispose of these apps, and when they can't, well, we have companies like Browsium, or we can host it on a terminal server or something. But really, nobody is developing for this new apps anymore. It's just those apps that refuse to die. Okay, so this is a nice statement from Microsoft IE blog. The transition to the plug-in free web is happening today. Web pages of the future will hopefully not use any plugins at all. So the actual solution for the problem that Douglas Crawford defined, the plug for the hole, is this statement that's taken out of the W3C. The W3C is that body, that organization that's in charge of the HTML standard. This is how they define the purpose of HTML5. The main area that has not been adequately addressed by HTML5 is the vogue subject that is referred to as web applications. These specifications attempt to rectify this. And in fact, the original name for HTML5, before it became known as HTML5, was Web Applications 1.0. So HTML5 is not only about web applications, but that's its primary focus. And this is another very nice quote from Steve Jobs that he sent in a very famous letter and email in 2010 called Thoughts on Flash, in which he basically killed Flash. Well, he articulated his decision that has started killing Flash even before then, but this is really the articulation of this concept. Okay, another HTML5 demo. This is, again, the HTML5 logo that we saw before, but this time as an HTML app. This is not a video. This 3D effect is being done in real time on this endpoint device. And just to show this, I can actually take these bars and play with it. And again, as you can see, this is immediately responsive and nice effect. And by the way, one of the things about this Chromebook has very weak hardware. It can last for something like 10 hours on a battery charge, but the price you pay is that the hardware is very weak. And despite this fact, you can do all these cool effects, again, in HTML, which is usually not associated with fast and performance, and it utilizes the GPU, and again, this is something that we'll talk about further down the line. So in terms of HTML5, HTML5 is the latest version of HTML. It's not something new, it's a new version. The previous version, not surprisingly, was called HTML4. It didn't have a logo, but that was its name. It's a common standard. The standards body, the W3C, and another organization called the WHATWG all support this common standard. And in fact, all the browser manufacturers really try hard to adhere to this standard. Sometimes they push the standard into different directions. Sometimes they implement certain aspects of the standard sooner or later. But they all strive to adhere to the same standard. It's an evolution, not a revolution. It's completely backward compatible with older browser. You know, the older browser will not show the animation, but it won't barf, it won't break. The page will download, and what the browser can show, it will show. It's still evolving. It's, I've added new demos to this presentation from London because new stuff has been added to HTML5 within that 2-month period. I once talked with Brian about this, and I told him that from a developer point of view, it's kind of like having a new version of Windows every month. but it's a new version of Windows that enhances the previous version. It doesn't break all the stuff that you used to have most of the time. And again, it eliminates the dependencies on plugins, and it's promoted by Apple, Microsoft, Google, Mozilla Foundation, and Opera. In fact, all these companies really compete on who can make the better browser, which is great. I mean, think about it. The 4 out of the 5 or 6 leading software companies in the world are striving to see who can make the best browser. As you can guess, this really drives browser development forward. And it's moving forward step by step. They don't just, with the possible exception of Microsoft, all the others just keep on releasing newer versions with 1 more feature, 2 more features. Chrome has, in 3 years, Chrome has gone from version 1 to version 20, because each time they release a new, the numbers really don't mean that much. They add a few features, and it's a new version. And as I said before, each browser is taking a somewhat different route. Adding the features somewhat differently, usually based on which features they are promoting into the standard. The building blocks. HTML5, you basically take HTML and then you add a couple of new tags and new attributes to existing tags and new values to some of the existing attributes. You have CSS3. CSS, okay, so HTML is all those things that you see in an HTML page with the open bracket, the closed bracket, stuff like body and title. CSS is attributes that you can associate with particular tags, which give them, colors and fonts and stuff like that. So they've enhanced it. There's a new standard called CSS3, which adds a lot of capabilities. Again, we will see it in some of the demos. And it's all GPU accelerated, which is great in terms of performance and battery life. JavaScript, it has new APIs and it's much, much faster. Okay, so here's a very quick example of a very short HTML application. We see a doc type on the top saying this is an HTML document, the HTML tag, the head section with a title, so that's what you see on the browser title on the top, on the tab. You have a style which basically says that buttons on this page should have a white text color with a blue background color. Then we define one button in there with a text click me in it. We find that button based on its ID, and we associate a function, a JavaScript function, with the click event for that button, and all that function does is pop up a message box saying clicked. This is totally valid HTML. This is a short app which does something. Not something very useful, but still does something. JavaScript performance. This is very interesting. So back when Chrome was released, the Chrome browser, it was already at that time considered to be one of the fastest browsers, including in terms of JavaScript performance. Well, look what happened since then. We are now around Chrome 21, 22, and it's approximately 4.5 times faster than it used to be in terms of JavaScript performance. JavaScript performance in certain scenarios is approaching native app performance, which from my perspective, and for those of you who may know the JavaScript language, is quite amazing. There was a particular time, why did that happen? There was a particular time around Chrome 10 where you can see that JavaScript made a jump in performance. They added an optimizer called Crankshaft. For those of you who are interested in this sort of thing, I recommend reading about it. It does some amazing shit. Really astounding. It optimizes the code, and sometimes the optimizations don't work, so it rolls back optimizations. Really amazing what they do, what they manage to do within the browser in terms of performance. But what this is saying is going back to that point about HTML5 applications having native app performance, one of the reasons is because JavaScript has become so fast. So again, they didn't just give a logo to HTML5, they gave the logos to the various functionality areas in HTML5. We're talking about connectivity, new features, WebSockets and server-side effects, CSS, styling, device access, stuff like geolocation. You know what, I'll just run through this slide because we will have demos for most of this stuff. So this is, again, these are the logos that we saw for the functionality areas, but this time, again, done in 3D app. Basically, by the way this works is you just take the logos and you associate CSS 3D transformations with them. So there's no code associated with it. It's declarative programming. You just say, I want this to spin, and it does. And it does it using the GPU, not the CPU. So the device remains cool. It's fast, relatively fast, even on this slow hardware. It eats up less battery. Okay, so we saw these cool effects, high-level effects. Let's drill down to kind of lower-level effects or low-level capabilities that were added into HTML5. Everybody's familiar with the form field where you can enter stuff into forms. That's what we do most of the time in HTML5. Well, it turns out that they added new form field types, like email. So you can see the type is email, and I put a placeholder which put text in the field, and I also specified that this field is required and has a focus automatically. So, for example, because it's required, if I click on the submit button without filling it, I get this nice message that says you need to fill in the field. And if I write something which isn't actually an email and try to submit it, again, it issues a warning. Now, obviously, for those of you who are familiar with HTML and have done stuff with HTML, you could do this stuff with libraries like jQuery or whatever, but it used to mean that you had to include this library. There were versioning problems. The page loaded slower because it had to download a lot of stuff. You had to learn additional stuff in order to be able to create what is usually a very simple thing. Well, in this case, by just using these attributes in the field, I get all this functionality. And there's actually another advantage. If I try this page on an iPad, when the virtual keyboard open, I will see that the @ sign is actually present. You know, in the iPad, the virtual keyboard changes itself based on the type of the field. So in this case, just because it's in a regular text field, you don't get the @ key, and you have to switch to the alternate keyboard, virtual keyboard. In this case, you just get it in the main keyboard. Additional field types, URLs, numbers. You can just type in numbers, a range. Again, stuff that you could do with jQuery or whatnot, but in this case, it's much easier. And let's see if this works. Hopefully it will. I'm not sure. Hello. Voice support. And it basically is just one attribute that I added on top of the field, telling it that it should recognize voice input, and it does. But you're not just constrained to using fields. You can do more fancy stuff. For example, you can do stuff like that. So you can create the types of interfaces that people usually associate with native applications, not with HTML5 applications. Not with web applications, I mean. Okay, so I said before, I'm going to skip over some stuff which I went into depth in London. One of them is this thing. It turns out that modern browsers have a built-in development environment which is usually pretty amazing. It's called in Chrome the Dev Tools, Firebug, IE calls it F12 because that's the key that opens it. It's an amazing utility. It's great for developers, but it's also great for people who are just looking or maintaining websites because it has all sorts of tools that helps you analyze your website and see if it performs well or not. I really had a lot of fun with this in London, but it basically ate up half my session. So if this isn't, I'll get back to that if we have time at the end, but if not, you can watch that in the video. It's not available on mobile platforms, but for example, with Chrome on Android, you can actually do remote debugging, which means I can hook up my Android via USB to my laptop and from within the browser on the laptop, remotely debug the browser on the mobile device, which is really cool. And, okay, never mind. Oh, the dev tools themselves are implemented as a web app. And again, if we have time, I'll show you. You can see that it's pretty amazing. What can they do? They can show a live view of the HTML DOM tree. You can view and modify CSS attributes. You have like a built-in profiler. You can monitor network activity. You can debug the JavaScript, profile memory and CPU, audit page performance, and so on and so forth. Really a very useful and pretty amazing tool. Okay, getting to to a fun part. The browser, at the end of the day, is about displaying stuff to users. People associate the browser with graphics, and not surprisingly, browsers have a lot of graphic options. So you've got vector graphics, you've got raster graphics. Does everybody know the difference between vector graphics and raster graphics, or is this something that, okay. Think, a simple explanation, think of raster graphics like MS Paint, and think of vector graphics like Visio. When you do vector graphics, you're working with visual elements, and you basically say this is a line and it's here, and this is a starting coordinate and the ending coordinate. And if you zoom in, for example, you won't see the jaggies because it's basically just drawing a line, and it's redrawing the line as you zoom. And the line, usually the elements are remembered, so you can take that box or line or whatever and then move it to somewhere else and change its attribute. With MS Paint, you draw an element, but once it's drawn, it effectively becomes pixels on the page, and you can't play with it afterwards. And if you zoom, you will actually see the blocks get bigger as you zoom in. So in some cases, vector graphics are preferable. For example, when creating diagrams. In some cases, raster graphics are preferable, and we'll see an example of when in a minute. It also has 3D graphic capabilities. As we saw before, it can play videos directly on the page. And it has built-in transitions, animations, and effects as part of CSS that you can basically associate with any HTML5 element. And everything, well, not in every browser, but it's getting there. Everything is GPU accelerated. Here are examples of CSS effects. These are static effects, but these are not images. This is all just text. This is text that I can select and copy. So, people have been wanting round borders in HTML forever. Now that round borders are very easy, I'll guess that they'll go out of style and nobody will use them anymore. You have box shadows. This is not images. It's creating the shadow on the fly. You can use images as a border, create gradient backgrounds, 3D text, rotated text. You can play with fonts, all this stuff. This is cool. Animations can be done declaratively, which means you just specify the starting state, the end state, and the browser takes care of everything else. So there's no loop here. Again, for the developers, there's no loop here moving the things step by step. You just say, this is how it's supposed to start. This is how I want it to look at the end. This is the function that defines how the progress occurs. Go. Okay, so we were talking about vector graphics. Something called SVG, or scalable vector graphics. So as an example, I was talking before about the fact that there are no jaggies. Even if I zoom, as you can see, everything is totally smooth because, again, it's defined using shapes, and the shapes are a circle is a circle regardless of the zoom level. So Canvas. A lot of people, when they talk about HTML5, actually talk about Canvas. Canvas is kind of the star of the show for HTML5. What is Canvas? A canvas is a region of the web page that you can freely draw into as using raster operations. Basically, there's a JavaScript API which you can use to perform, for example, 3D raster drawing operations. For example, you can draw squares, line, split images, use all sorts of composition operations. You also have direct pixel manipulation, so if all these operations are not enough, you can directly add the pixels and just change the pixels. It has opacity and overlays. It's a lot of fun. The drawing area can be reused, so if you're looking at a lot of these new games that are coming out, and again, if we have time, we'll see one or two, this is how they work. This is an example of using Canvas, in this case for what we call HTML5 remote access, which I'll talk about in a different session. But in this case, this whole big block is just a canvas, and it's getting the remote screen as mostly the sequence of bitmaps, or images, actually, more accurately, and then just rendering them into the canvas. And this, by the way, is live, so I can click the Start menu, or I can open the Excel and actually type in stuff. So it's using the fact that HTML canvas can be redrawn onto to, in effect, create this sort of, state after state after state in HTML5. But Canvas is not limited just to 2D operations. You can also do 3D operations in the same canvas using something called WebGL. For those of you who are familiar with OpenGL, WebGL is a subset of OpenGL, and it effectively gives you 3D drawing operations. Again, GPU accelerated, for creating virtual worlds, as it were. It's a JavaScript API. The shader code is executed by the local GPU. As I said, it's based on OpenGL. And the rendering service, again, is an HTML5 canvas. Basically, when you start using a canvas, you basically tell it, do I want to use it as a 2D drawing area, or do I want to use it as a 3D drawing area? Here's a nice example. Hopefully, it will load in the Wi-Fi speed that we have here. How many of you are old enough to have played with Quake? Okay, so let's see if it loads. This is going to be a Quake simulation. It's not a real actual Quake game. It's loading slowly, unfortunately, so I need to... Okay. Can you also hear it's using sound, the sound APIs, for those of you who are sitting close enough. And hopefully it will finish loading in a bit. If not, then I'll show it to you after. Okay, here it goes. So it's creating the world slowly, and this is live, which means that I can move around. It's still loading some of the images, some of the textures. But as you can see, I'm moving around. I can look around, and I can move forward or back. It's live. And this is done, so it downloaded all the images, all the frames, and it's basically just doing it live in real time on this very weak device. This was originally obviously created for games, but as you can imagine, it can be used for most anything. So, okay, why does it want to disable my mouse cursor? I don't know, let's deny. Okay. Audio and video. So we saw some video examples before. As I said, there are new tags, audio and video, which make it very easy to embed audio and video content into the web page. It uses all the industry standard media formats. You have visual user controls, as you would expect. It's scriptable. You have advanced features like captioning, so you can put in subtitles and whatnot. Another audio thing that you have, though, is what is known as the Web Audio API, which is the audio tag is primarily for just doing playback. But again, if you think about what you may want to do, for example, in the context of a game, is you want sound effects, not sound playback. You know, when the user shoots, you want to bang when something explodes. So they introduced the Web Audio API as a really sophisticated API that enables sound synthesizing, filtering, 3D audio effects and whatnot. A very sophisticated API. You can schedule sound events to occur at a very precise time and so forth. Enhanced communication options in HTML5. By the way, I've kind of lost track of time, so hopefully I still have a bit of time. Okay. Enhanced communication. WebSockets, another star of HTML5. I didn't create a demo for this because, well, if you remember that virtual desktop example that you saw before, the communication was done using WebSockets. By the way, in my other session on HTML5 remote access, I will talk a lot more and in greater detail about the new communication options of HTML5 and also about Canvas, actually showing some Canvas code. So WebSockets, basically the concept was that HTTP, which is the underlying protocol of the web, is not sufficient in a lot of scenarios, especially if, again, we talk about the fact that HTML5 is about doing things in real time in a very responsive way. HTTP is a request-response protocol. You send a request, the server responds. The server cannot initiate a response without first getting a request. The client is somewhat restricted in making additional requests until it gets the response. There's a lot of overhead associated with the request and response. WebSockets do away with all of this. Effectively, what they do is they bring a lot of the capabilities and flexibility that's associated with basic TCP sockets to web pages, which is why the name is WebSockets. This protocol is firewall and web proxy friendly, not as much as HTTP, but certainly way beyond other protocols. It supports mixed textual and binary payloads. For those of you who may be familiar with it, originally it just was textual. Now it's both textual and binary. And again, bye-bye to request response because it's full duplex. Each side can initiate the communication. There's also something known as cross-origin resource sharing. It used to be very difficult for a web page coming from server A to get content from a web server B. You had to jump through all sorts of hoops, like actually send your request to web server A, have it request the content from web server B as if it were a web client, and then get it and download it to the browser. Now, if web server B authorizes it, content coming from a page that was downloaded from web server A can actually do direct requests to web server B. This is useful because people were creating web-based services that they wanted other pages to be able to access and use. Sorry? Question?
Sounds like a great security loophole.
Again, the other web server has to authorize it. Basically, the browser makes a sort of an almost dummy request to that other web server. The other web server has to say, yes, I accept your query, and only then will it actually start communicating. The basic assumption is that the browser itself is inherently secure and that HTML5 cannot compromise itself the browser that it's running in. It cannot modify the actual native code of that browser. It's running in what is known as the browser sandbox. WebRTC. Yeah. But at the end of the day, isn't everything an assumption? Okay, so what is WebRTC? This is something super new. In fact, it's so new, it's only supported right now in the latest versions of Chrome, but other browser vendors have committed to adding this functionality as well, talking about security, possible security issues. Basically, it's a JavaScript API for browser-based real-time cross-browser communication. The idea here is simple. They wanted to make it possible to create any type of communication-oriented native app inside the browser For example, chat clients, Skype clients. The future is, instead of having a Skype client as a native app, having a Skype client as a browser-based app. Now, what do you need to be able to do in order to achieve that? Well, you need to be able to access local camera and microphone and capture the video or audio streams out of these devices. You need to add peer-to-peer communication. I mean, browsers have always been about the browser as a client talking to the web server. So now they're talking about adding functionality for browsers to be able to communicate directly with each other as peers in a network. And it's adding the concept of data channels, which is a P2P data transfer protocol, by the way, implemented over UDP. You know, when we all talk about all the arguments about ICA versus PCOIP and RFX2, UDP, TCP. So web has always been about TCP. HTTP is implemented over TCP. WebSockets are implemented over TCP. Well, in this context, they're adding support from UDP because if you're doing stuff like video chat, that's best served by UDP protocol. It's integrated with a browser playback and manipulation capabilities, and I think I'll show you a cool demo of that. So, what do people do when they have access to the camera? Well, and to effects. Well, the first thing that they do is they create a camera booth application, a photo booth app. So let's start this one. And again, everything that you're doing here, you're seeing here, is done in HTML. Why doesn't it click allow? Let's try exit full screen and see if it helps. Okay. So now it's downloading the resources for this web application, and we'll see how it works. And by the way, you can't see it. You know what? I'll show it to you. For those of you who can see it, the light next to the video camera has turned on. So now I know that the camera is on and you can see me. And let's start playing with this. So I can do all sorts of effects on top of the input video stream. As you can see, let's try some other effects. Some effects don't work that well on this hardware. Let me find one that I really like. Oh, I missed it. I really like this one. And by the way, if I hold my hand, you may see that the snow will actually gather on my hand or on my eyebrows. By the way, let's see if I can get all of you in a snowstorm despite the weather. And let's click smile, everybody. See if I can hit this. Okay, so here's our session in a snowstorm. And this is all done in HTML. Now, this won't work on most browsers. It works here because this is the latest version of Chrome, but Firefox have committed to adding it. I think Opera have already added some of it, and somebody told me that they saw, yeah, go on.
Dan, you know, your fourth slide or so said, create once, run anywhere. And you're talking about the fact that this only works on Chrome.
And then each browser gets updated about every 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Which means that nothing's ever going to work anyway.
Well, again, it's all, first of all, it's all cumulative. So it's...
Well, that's not completely true. You can run some, iOS does some things that Android doesn't do, which is some things that Windows Phone doesn't do. All in HTML5, you can go look and see where they come with standards. And, you know, the thing about this demo, to get the camera, you know, if I told my people to write everything in HTML5, bring the camera up to about 30 seconds here to get access to it. That's not, if I were to do that in an app on here, my users would throw the app out before they got the first use.
Okay, so first of all, as I said, the standard is evolving, but it's evolving in a cumulative way. Now, obviously, if you use the latest bleeding edge features of the browser, especially features that are available in one browser, then certainly you are limited to that particular browser. But the WebRTC, for example, which is really the most bleeding edge example in everything that I've shown so far, is already part of the W3C, and there is a commitment by the other vendors that by the end of this year or early next year, they'll support it. So I doubt many people will be writing web apps using this feature now, but there is a good chance that they will be writing features, web apps using this feature, let's say, a year and a half or 2 years from now. Now, this feature is new, but everything else that I've shown until now, the canvas example, the 2D or 3D canvas example, the forms examples, all of this stuff, the 3D animations, the videos, that will work on Firefox, on Chrome, on Safari, on IE10. Some of it will work on IE9. So for sure, you can't, if somebody's still using IE8, and he won't upgrade, then he won't get the benefit of these features. But going forward, these features will be there for all browsers.
But that step is very similar to the upgrade to Java plugins. I mean, really, there's nothing but it's not a solvable problem.
The difference is, though, that again, you know what? We'll get to the browser update cycle in a minute, so it's a little bit later on in the presentation. Yeah.
The browser needs to update itself, and IT doesn't get to control.
Yeah, for sure. Now, again, regarding performance, look, it's a definite issue and I'll get to that towards the end of the presentation, assume I don't run out of time. I definitely agree that there are some scenarios in which native apps are preferable than browser-based apps. So, I'm not saying that 2 years down the line, we all will be doing just HTML5 apps. I don't think that will happen.
Actually, what you're saying is cached preloaded HTML5 is the low point. Right? The reason why you have to download this blog and stuff, it could be something like that.
It's actually, you know what? Let's hold off with that. I'm going to get to some of the offline stuff in a minute. Okay, so related to that, client-side storage. One of the things that was added to HTML5 is the ability to store data on the client side. If you think about an app like Gmail or email client, most email clients at the end of the day are kind of like database synchronization between a client app and a server-side app. And if you have a web client for email that doesn't have the ability to do client-side storage, it's very limited in its capability and in its performance, and will generate a lot of network traffic. It's the same for other apps like Twitter or whatever. So what they've done is that they've added enhanced capabilities for client-side storage. So you still have all the old stuff. Again, every old stuff still works. So you could use cookies like you've always done. But you've got a lot of new stuff. So you've got something called DOM, local storage or session storage, which is basically just a very simple key value pair type storage, which is persistent per session or per user. But then you can get way more advanced than that. There's something called IndexedDB, which is a sort of a hierarchical object-oriented storage, where you can basically associate any type of an object with an index. And you can store very large amount of data, including binary data, essentially whatever you want. At one point in time, there was the concept of adding a SQL database directly into the browser, and Chrome still has it, but it's been effectively deprecated. So nobody's really supposed to be using it anymore, and they're telling everybody, if you've used it, switch away from it to IndexedDB instead. And there's a file system API, which basically has like two aspects in it. One aspect is that they create a sandboxed file system-like area in whatever storage type of media your device is using, and you can actually create folders and read-write files from that area. But it also gives you ability to access file data if the user specifically grants access to that particular file, for example, by selecting it as a file from the file field in a form. So here's an example of the file API. So what I'm going to show you here is that I have the ability to drag a file from the local file system onto the web page and just drop it in. This is my daughter, by the way. So the file wasn't uploaded to a web server and then the image sent down and pushed into the browser. Rather, the browser was able to directly read and use this file, but only because I, the user, specifically dropped that file into the browser. And it could be for any type of file that the browser is able to handle. And actually beyond that, because now browsers can also handle binary data, so really any type of file can be dropped in it and the browser can do stuff with that file. Again, not any file in the system, files that the user specifically selects for that browser application, for that web application. Web intents, another thing that's on the bleeding edge of the browsers, but I chose to include this because it really shows how the web is evolving to become, in a sense, an operating system. On the Android, and they actually copied the concept from Android, you have the concept of intents as the mechanism for applications to interact with one another. One of the main features of operating systems is the ability of two separate applications that were designed by different people for different purposes to interact with each other. So it can be something as simple as copy and paste, and it can be something as sophisticated as OLE. For example, the ability to take a spreadsheet and stick it into a Word document, and that spreadsheet is still alive and updating. Even though the applications aren't really necessarily familiar with each other, they're able to interact via features and capabilities provided by the operating system itself. Well, the intents are a similar concept for the Android, where they created a mechanism which enables Android apps, again from different vendors for different purposes, to interact with each other. And then they took this, Google is driving this particular web standard. They took the same concept and added it to the browser. I'm running out of time, so I'll make it very quick. Basically, it's a concept that enables one web app to say, I handle this type of content, and for another web app to push content there. Here's a simple example. Think about BriMadden.com, where you have an option when you register to specify your photo. But let's say all your photos are stored in a cloud-based service. Well, what do you have to do today? Today you have to go to, let's say, to that cloud-based service, download the image to your local file system, edit that image if you want to, and then using a local app, and then upload it into BriMadden.com. Well, with web intents, you can actually have that web app say, I need a photo, and then all the cloud provider, image storage providers would be listed, and the user can select an image from any one of these providers, and it will be fed by the browser directly from the cloud storage into that app. So, or for example, I would be able to very easily use image editing apps that are wholly independent of both as a means to modify the image before it gets used in the context of BriMadden.com. I understand this is kind of vague, By the way, there is a cool, Google had their event not long ago, and they had a presentation about this. So if you search in YouTube, you can probably find the video of it there. But it really shows how the web is evolving to become a platform, like an operating system in and of itself. There are other proposed device APIs, stuff like contacts, calendars, and whatnot. I want to show you a demo on the iPad, but I'll keep it right to the end in case I run out of time. If not, I'll show you to whomever stays afterwards. We were talking about this before, about the browser adoption cycle. This is how it used to be with IE. It was like layers. It's like the Grand Canyon. Every time a new browser is released, it's another layer on top of the existing browsers. So this is the browser adoption cycle, the way that we used to have it. And this is what's happening now, for example, with Chrome. Because browsers have a built-in self-update mechanism, this whole FUIT concept, browsers basically update themselves. And this makes life much easier for web developers because they can essentially develop for the latest and greatest, and they don't have to worry about legacy browsers. As you can see, Chrome 7 is effectively gone. You don't have to worry about it. You basically can develop for Chrome. When that was made in a year ago, you could develop for Chrome 10 or 11 and forget about anything that was older than that. And by the way, Microsoft is building the same type of self-update mechanism into IE 10 as well. So we were talking, HTML5 is not all good. There are some downsides with it. It can be difficult to recruit developers, especially because you've got the web designers and you've got the developers, and a lot of developers didn't consider JavaScript and HTML as a real platform for writing code. So it can be difficult to find actual real developers that are proficient in these technologies. The standards is a work in progress. It is evolving. Sometimes they do backtrack a little bit. It doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen occasionally. So if you are living on the bleeding edge, you do occasionally pay the price. Cross-browser compatibility can still be a chore, especially with old IE, but frameworks like jQuery and whatnot make life easier in that regard. Offline support is still problematic. Again, I don't really have a lot of time to get into that. Mobile browsers are lacking in functionality, but getting better. iOS 6 is actually a very good browser. You've got Chrome for Android finally, because WebKit on the Android was real shit. And IE 10, when it finally comes out in the official product, is a very good browser. Building application UIs can be more trouble than you would anticipate. It seems that HTML can do the low-level stuff very easily and some of the very sophisticated 3D stuff very easily, but the middle ground, building an app that looks like, I don't know, Visual Studio, can be very difficult in some cases, but they've introduced a new model called Flexbox and regions, which again will make this stuff easier going forward. This is a good thing and a bad thing. Backward compatibility trumps functionality. They don't add new functionality if it breaks backward compatibility. So sometimes you're stuck with not so great functionality because they can't change it. When is a native app preferable? A native app preferable if you're only targeting one platform. If you only care about the iPad, that's it, then develop your app for the iPad. But how many times can we commit in advance to only needing to ever support one platform with an app? If you need very specific app look and feel, it's easier to create an app that looks like an iPad app using Apple's APIs than it is in HTML5. If you need to get the maximum performance that the platform can provide, then you probably want to write a native app. Although again, the browsers, because they're driven by the leading companies and because they use GPU acceleration, it's getting to the point where it can be difficult to create a native app that's actually faster than browser apps in some scenarios. If offline is a key feature for you, do it as a native app, at least for now. If you need full local device access, if you need to create, I don't know, access to like a point of sale system or something, HTML5 is not for you. And if you want your app to be in the App Store because you want to use the features like the monetizing features that are there or the search features that are associated with it, that's another reason. And if you want to make your client code less accessible, because with HTML5, somebody can do a view source or use one of those development environments and basically just see all your JavaScript. When is an HTML5 app preferable? In all other scenarios, in my opinion. My opinion, unless you have a good reason to do it as a native app, do it as a web app. So my HTML postulate is HTML5 when you can, native when you must. There are a lot of resources for HTML5, and that basically concludes it. So thank you very much.